Well, hello, everybody. Really happy to have everybody join this panel this afternoon. Welcome to the Overseas Press Club of America. This is our pre-World Cup panel with three fantastic experts. Firstly, I'm Vivian Watt. I'm a member of the board of the OPC, and we are really delighted today to have three people here who've spared some time in their crazy schedule before the World Cup. First, Simon Cooper. Simon, a fellow Parisian and a columnist for the Financial Times and a veteran writer about global soccer, as we'll call it this afternoon, given that we're the OPC of America. And a very keen observer of all things FIFA. Next, we have Miguel Maduro in Lisbon. Miguel really became sort of famous within FIFA for having attempted to overhaul the organization after the blowout scandal of 2015, when there was the FBI indictments and a whole lot of senior people arrested for corruption and money laundering, in fact, and then was, fairly shortly thereafter let go by Infantino, along with his fellow reformers who had been appointed to try and reform the organization. Miguel, thanks a lot for joining. And finally, in Vancouver, we have Alexandra Addison, who at the time that she was within FIFA was known as Alexandra Rangi. Is that correct, Alexandra?
Yes,
I think I'm
Rangi,
pronouncing it correct, Rangi, with a W, who also had been a member of the Independent Governance Committee, essentially a body that had been called in to try and reform, completely reconfigure the way the global governance of football was remade, let's say, after the scandal. So we are a decade after this incredible event and a decade into Gianni Infantino's presidency. And I think it's fair to say that the kinds of reforms that might have been expected after 2015 have not happened, although FIFA is quite a different organization, it seems, and a way richer organization. We're going to try wrap our heads around this, and for the journalists who are on this call especially, this is on the record. These are great people to quote if you're covering the World Cup, fantastic sources of information. Simon has a new book out called World Cup Fever, which I encourage everybody to read. And I have a far more modest contribution in the current issue of Fortune magazine, how FIFA's money machine controls global soccer. With that, maybe I'll open it to you, Simon. I noticed that the LA Review of Books did a long review of your book, in which it basically said that, quoted you as saying that the entire world of global soccer has been corrupted by money and power. Can you just tell us briefly, what does that mean? Because all we see, of course, watching on TV is great games and the excitement of the fans and the stadium and so on. What does it mean that it's been corrupted by money and power?
Well, those are the reviewers' words, not mine. I still think that soccer is a great game, and we must keep both these things in our mind, that there are bad people around it, including FIFA, and that people are allowed to enjoy the soccer of the World Cup. So the amounts of money have grown quite significantly involved in the World Cup, from television rights and sponsorship. And most obviously at this World Cup, the ticket prices have gone through the roof, or the ticket prices, at least that FIFA's trying to get. It's not clear they will get lots of people to pay them. So even quite ordinary games, they're trying to get thousands of dollars for tickets. which has never happened before at World Cups, completely out of the tradition of World Cups. In the past, you could get into almost any game for less than the equivalent of $100 today. So the amounts have gone up. FIFA takes about 9 billion from this World Cup. And what happens with it is somewhat opaque, but the idea is to channel it to the 200 or so national football associations, from India to the Marshall Islands. And often they get completely equivalent amounts, not divided per capita. So India gets the same as the Marshall Islands. A lot of these federations are very small, kind of one-man bands, where the president of the federation might stick that money in his back pocket or in his bank account without really any supervision. And then the deal is that those 200 national federation presidents vote for FIFA, vote for Infantino, who has actually been re-elected unopposed twice, and he's created a sort of autocratic grip on FIFA. So FIFA's game, they have this one property that makes money, the Men's World Cup, channel that money to the national federations. Don't worry what the national federations do with it largely. And then Infantino remains in power forever. Fans have no grip on it. Media has no grip on it. Infantino has not given a press conference in 3 years. He operates as a kind of one-man band. So if you want to know what he's doing, what FIFA policy is, follow his personal Instagram account where most of the announcements get made. That's the corruption in World Cup soccer. In clubs always lose money. There's a lot of Americans now who've bought big European clubs hoping to make money out of them. I think they will be disappointed. The money in soccer historically goes to players and agents.
So, Alexandra, I wanted to quickly, throw this to you. You are in an international anti-corruption organization, Trace International. Are we looking at like kind of a sort of run-of-the-mill organization? Are there like dozens such international organizations that are a little bit like FIFA, that run like FIFA, which I guess you would most accurately described as a kind of system of patronage, or is this like really something very peculiar?
It's peculiar in two ways. It's peculiar in the governance world more generally. When I was first asked to join the IGC, my experience was entirely corporate, commercial bribery. And I thought, well, how hard can this be? It's a nonprofit. It's dedicated to a sport. There's this very strong sense of, I believed, public interest and a desire to improve things. And that was all a mistake. I mean, it turned out to be just a kind of window dressing effort. But then within the sports world, it's pretty singular as well, in the sense that, as Simon has noted, it's just extraordinary sums of money. There are other international sporting organizations like the IOC that have struggled with past corruption issues, but the amounts of money are just entirely different. And organizations like the IOC have a clearer sense, I think, of their stakeholders. One of the things that really startled me when I started on the IGC was nobody could really answer the question, who are the stakeholders? Are they the fans? Are they the players? Are they the clubs, the FAs? It wasn't clear. And if you can't identify the ultimate beneficiaries of your organization, then there's something wrong with the fundamental structure. And that seems to have always been true at FIFA. All roads lead back to Zurich. And the ultimate beneficiary of everything that FIFA does always seems to be up on the hill in Zurich.
Miguel, you and here I might bungle this, so please jump in if I do. You're a Portuguese, you're both an academic, you're a jurist, you were a Governor General, is that correct, of the European Court of Justice?
It's called an Advocate General, but he's actually a judge.
General, pardon me.
It has the status of a judge. He's not an attorney, but yes, let's say I was a member or a justice at the European Court of Justice. That's the easiest thing.
So you and I spoke a few weeks ago when I was writing my story for Fortune magazine, and you basically, when I said to you, okay, can we reform FIFA? And I don't think you hesitated for more than half a second before you said, no, it's impossible from within. So explain to me, I mean, because most say multinational corporations or most, even government agencies go through a sort of remake, every decade or so. What's so impossible to reform about FIFA?
So I've never been asked to give so many interviews about FIFA as in the recent weeks. You imagine it was not only yours because of the World Cup. And I've been saying to you and your colleagues that I think that there must be a moment when we stop asking questions to FIFA because we will not get any answers. As Simon said, Infantino hasn't given a press conference in 3 years. They don't even care about answering anymore. And our questions need to be addressed as actually to our political authorities and public authorities. How do they allow this to go on? And the reason is precisely because the forms of power that have consolidated themselves in FIFA make it impossible. There's no incentives whatsoever for internal reform. So the real question is, how is this allowed to go on on the part of our political and public authorities? Think about this. I mean, I know of no other area of such social importance in the life of people and of markets of such significance. I mean, there is a study of the European Commission that mentions, I was surprised by the amount that they were referring, that mentions that just football has an impact of around 3.5% in the EU GDP. It's huge. And these markets are basically regulated, governed by a private entity that says that is a non-profit, claims to be a non-profit public interest private entity, but is a private interest entity nevertheless. And this private entity, and I think this is at the heart of the problems, is embedded in a profound conflict of interest, because they are at the same time the regulators of this social sphere and these markets. They determine who gets to work on them, who can be a football player, who the clubs that can act in this market. They decide on media rights. They decide on merchandise. They decide on the events that can take place within sports. In this case, football. The competitions are set up by them, but they are also the main commercial actors in this market at the same time. I mean, I know of no other markets where this is allowed to go on. You are the regulator and the main commercial actor at the same time, and this is what supports, if not puts in place, the system of patronage that Simon was talking about. Basically, this gives a lot of money to the leadership of FIFA that then they use to consolidate their power by rewarding those that are loyal to them and sanctioning those that in somehow criticize or challenge their power. So this is then used to absolutely consolidate and reinforce and create a system of absolute power. The irony is that they claim that they ought to have this extreme autonomy in governing football because they claim this bottom-up legitimacy, somehow by referring to representing all the stakeholders of football, when they don't. They not at all. And is the total opposite of that, as Alexander was saying. I mean, it is basically a political cartel with a small group of people that controls the money, and by disbursing this money maintains an absolute grip over power, and it goes on like that. And that's the reason why, even if they claim there's this bottom-up legitimacy, they operate top-down. And that's why not being accountable to anyone, and then not even being subject to any mechanisms of checks and balances, because that's an additional problem that I experienced firsthand. That is that the independent institutions that are supposed to constitute those checks and balances, to make them accountable, to scrutinize them, are not really independent. And when they try to behave independent, they are basically set aside. This means, and this system of power ultimately explains why they no longer correspond to the public interests and the public goods that they ought to regulate and they ought to promote.
So, Simon, I want to come back to you because I think like whoever follows global football global soccer might recall this effort a few years ago for some of the elite European clubs to form a kind of competitor to FIFA, or at least a parallel system, the European Super League, as they would call it. And Infantino very quickly shut this down, basically said, you're going to, basically be, exiled from FIFA. I might be mischaracterizing what happened, but maybe you could explain that a little better, Simon. And also, is it basically impossible to start an alternative to FIFA or a parallel to FIFA?
I see the story of the Super League as a bit different. It was, as you say, the big European clubs. They wanted to break away from UEFA, the European football regulator, not play in UEFA's, not be subject to UEFA's jurisdiction, create their own closed league with no promotion relegation. And they lost because football fans rebelled against it. Football fans are attached to their national leagues as the most important, and they wanted promotion relegation. So the Super League failed because the fans opposed. The question of can you rebel against FIFA has come up in different ways. There have been periods, for example, around the time when South Africa was organizing the World Cup in 2010, and this relatively poor country was forced by FIFA to build all these so-called world-class stadiums. The South African government was unfortunately complicit in doing this, spent huge amounts of money on stadiums that are now white elephants, whereas South Africa, as you know, has many much greater needs. And there was talk then, well, what if some European federations, first of all, break away from FIFA, refuse to be part of this brutal system? So say Germany, England, the Scandinavian countries, Holland, Belgium, and say we need FIFA to reform because otherwise we'll not be part of the World Cup. In the end, countries did not dare to take this step because everyone wants to be part of the World Cup. It's the most storied competition in football, maybe in any sport. And the thing is that FIFA happens to have founded it in 1930 and therefore owns it. It can monetize it, can organize it. And no country is willing to do anything against FIFA that would entail leaving the World Cup. But even countries are so cowardly that they're worried that if they express opposition to FIFA, they won't be given any tournaments to host. So you might not get women's World Cups or youth World Cups, or if you ever want to bid for a men's World Cup, you'd be out. And also, even things like FIFA will punish you by giving you referees unfavorable to you. That's been a big issue, a worry of countries in the past. So no country has been willing to go with its principles and rebel against FIFA. Norway, led by the Federation president Lisa Klaveness, has been the most brave and outspoken, but they're part of the whole system.
So, Alexandra, I'm wondering, since you are in a non-specific anti-corruption organization, to what extent is FIFA's reputation and FIFA's image globally within the world of anti-corruption, advocates harmed by their actions? Or is the kind of, mass fandom around global soccer enough to kind of protect FIFA from any criticism just from non-soccer people?
So it's probably pretty telling that in my time there, Sepp Blatter was being interviewed about the Reputation and sort of blurted out that he wasn't a Bond villain. And when you're reduced to arguing that you're not a Bond villain, it says a great deal. The Reputation was then and continues to be absolutely appalling. And it was interesting to me because I wasn't known in the football world. I'm a governance person. The amount of social media that I got that said, in essence, we love football, we hate FIFA. I got that constantly, fix FIFA because it's our game. The sense of kind of global ownership of this sport is extraordinary. And the disdain for FIFA and the way that it conducts itself is extraordinary. I want to just sort of tack on to something Miguel said, because I think it's really important to the discussion about how this organization needs to be regulated. It's not going to regulate itself. We saw that very early on. It's got to be done by political oversight. But in fact, what we're seeing, not especially during this World Cup, during every World Cup, is the absolute opposite. FIFA reaches out and regulates the governments of the host countries, right? We saw that in Brazil when they famously required Brazil to reverse its laws about alcohol in the stadia. They manipulate the application of tax laws through contract and want their global nonprofit status to be recognized so that every dime that's earned in a host country comes out with them. Not only is nobody stepping up to regulate them, they're cowed. Governments like the United States, a democracy that should be able to throw its weight around a little bit, instead is getting, fawning peace prizes and handing over tax revenue. It's not lost on the fans that nobody is regulating FIFA and nobody has the appetite to do it, even if they can find a path to do it.
I'm kind of aware, Alexandra, that one big conflict that you had with FIFA was over the issue of sexism. And, when you talk to people, defenders of FIFA or people within FIFA, they'll say, well, one great thing they've done is kind of, put women's soccer on the global stage and made, the Women's World Cup a really, significant event. On the other hand, of course, the governance of FIFA is heavily male, almost entirely, I believe. Simon mentioned the Norwegian Football Federation as being the one outspoken, and I think one of the only federations that's actually led by a woman. So what is the situation currently? And maybe you can talk to this, Alexandra. Have they made any progress on this being like a heavily male-run, male-dominated world? And does it matter that it's male-dominated? Does that kind of, have an impact on its corruption or authoritarianism?
Well, it matters in the sense that it's the global organization for both men's and women's soccer. So for them to be celebrating the fact that they are, advancing women's soccer, that really should be the bare minimum, right? That should be the floor. That's really their job. The progress is interesting because when I served on the IGC, it was under Sepp Blatter, who, was horrifying on the sexism front. He was quoted as saying we could make women's soccer more popular by encouraging them to wear shorter shorts. I mean, he was undeterred by any sort of niceties on that issue. I think that has become a little more sophisticated under Infantino. I don't think we're seeing the really kind of grotesque sexist remarks we were then. But anytime you have an organization that appears to, and it's always, whether it's actually happening or just it's an appearance of sexism, then you're going to deter additional voices. And of course, you want the voices of all of your stakeholders, again, broadly defined, at the table. So if there are men at the table and not women at the table, then you're missing out on half the world's perspectives. And that's just kind of good governance more generally. But it was a symptom in my day there of something much clubbier. There was this very strong sense of a men's club. It wasn't just primarily male. It was men who had each other's backs, men who had similar understanding of the challenges that they were facing. And, the comparisons to the mafia and a criminal organization are rampant. And when you open up your governance to a greater diversity of voices, gender, race, everything, you're going to start to chip away at that. And FIFA has been very clear that they don't want to chip away at that. And the number of times I heard the expression, we like to keep that in the football family, which sounds like the mafia, right? They don't want transparency, they don't want diversity, and they certainly don't want change.
Well, I just want to switch to something that kind of really struck me, and it's not the first time Gianni Infantino has said things like this. He says it regularly. But for those of us who watched the FIFA Congress, which took place in Vancouver, in fact, he came out and constantly spoke about football uniting the world. This is his big slogan. And he attempted very ham-handedly to bring the Palestinian and Israeli football representatives up on stage to shake hands. And of course, the Palestinian representative was going to have none of that. And then very shortly after that, his address to the Milken Institute's Global Conference in LA, where Infantino said, we have to unite the world. If we don't do it, who will? As if FIFA has somehow become our, the kind of United Nations of our era or something. So, Miguel, I want to ask you about this. I mean, to me, I'm not in the football world. It sounds kind of ridiculous. How is this perceived within the football world? And now, like, is the kind of fan, like, hyper passions around football in some ways just playing into this notion?
Can I address two questions that Alexander and Simon raised before answering that? And because I think it's interesting examples that confirm both the issue of gender equality in FIFA and the question of the Super League. And on gender equality, I don't resist to tell a story of when I was the chair of the governance committee, and one of the first challenges that we encounter, one of the first conflicts that immediately made me think that maybe I wouldn't survive for long in my position. And it was the first Congress I had to supervise, was the AFC Congress in Goa. And for the first time, a new rule that had been introduced with the reforms following the 2015 scandals was a rule that required that in the elections on each confederation to the FIFA Council, at least one among the representatives to be elected, the members of the FIFA Council to be elected by each confederation, at least one ought to be a woman. That was the rule. And my committee receives this information on how this election was going to take place. And then I realized that they had created what they call, so for example, they had to elect 11 persons to the FIFA Council. And they had created among these 11 something that they call the female position. And all women were candidates to this female position. So they basically transformed at least one woman in not more than one woman. And when I noticed that to them, and I said, look, you're transforming a rule that is supposed to require a minimum female representation into a cap on female representation. I swear this is true, in the meeting that I had with their electoral committee, the initial answer was, well, but that is more than before. That was and this tells you, I mean, by the way, I then said that together with my colleagues, if they will go ahead with the elections like that we will not accept anyone elected under that procedure, because it clearly discriminated against women. And the next morning, they canceled the Congress and the elections, with me on the front together with Infantino, and claiming that our committee was interfering with their democratic autonomy. So this is just to tell you how the culture is foreign, completely foreign to any idea of gender equality or any female representation. So this is a very good example of how even a rule that was aimed to promote female representation could be transformed into a rule that actually limits the representation of women in a culture such as this. And so I didn't resist to tell this episode, because I think it's revealing of the culture of the organization. And then on the Super League, I think it's a good example of saying that the problems is not only with FIFA, is then on how this culture permeates the confederations too. And of the problem of the conflict of interest between being the commercial actor and the regulator at the same time. Because the reason why, and it was, Vivian, it was mostly UEFA that fought against the Super League. There is actually reports that Infantino was sympathetic to the idea of a Super League, because he wants to create its own Champions League at the global level to compete with the Champions League of UEFA, and so that there is a conflict between UEFA and FIFA on this, because they're competing for the same pot of money, obviously. But naturally, it's a conflict that doesn't come to the fore, is not made public because of that culture of La Familia. These problems are to be treated inside. No one dares to make this conflict public. But the reality is that UEFA itself, they fought the Super League not really because they are against the big clubs, but because the Super League was challenging their main revenue source, that is the Champions League. Their problem with the Super League was not with the model itself, was that they were going to lose the monopoly that they have over the European competitions, club competitions, where most of their money comes from. And the evidence for this is that if we look at the Champions League, it has to a large extent become a Super League. 20 years ago, 50% of the clubs that will reach the final stages of the equivalent of the Champions League or the Champions League were clubs outside the top 5 leagues of Europe. Now only 5% are of those clubs. So the Super League to a large extent is already, the Champions League is already controlled by a small group of clubs. And the additional evidence of this is that UEFA has granted the exclusive representation of all European clubs, small and medium and large, to the European Football Club Association that is absolutely controlled by the biggest clubs of Europe. So UEFA itself is recognizing and empowering the biggest clubs of Europe. Their problem with the Super League was not so much the model, but it was with them no longer being the commercial owners of that competition. This just to say that this problem of governance is one that is not exclusive of FIFA. We find it at the level of the confederations. And what you mentioned regarding Infantino and his claims to bring world peace and solve world problems, I mean, it's just a reflection, I think, is part of the narrative of the organization, of that window dressing, has this global organization for the good of the world. So it's part of their narrative to try to legitimate themselves and continue to benefit from this extreme high level of self-governance and regulatory autonomy on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think it's really an ego. I mean, in an organization where you are subject to no accountability, where you are treated like a king, where you no longer even have elections, you are voted in by acclamation, where the World Cup is awarded by acclamation itself. In an organization such as this, I mean, the person at the top often loses his grip on reality.
This might be a good moment to switch to another issue, which has become, increasingly evident. And you mentioned the Champions League, and of course, in Paris, there's been wild celebrations over PSG's win. But there's also been a lot of criticism if you read some of the online commentary in French of some people saying, here is a club that is totally financed, funded by an autocratic, Gulf monarchy, and the sponsorship money is vastly greater than any other club, and all the sponsors are basically Qatar entities. Simon, if I can switch to you, and just if you can give us an idea of just how big this issue of Gulf money is becoming within FIFA and within global soccer. We have Saudi that basically locked down the 2034 World Cup with no competitive bid at all. So how important is it?
Yeah, the phase we're in is that football and World Cups also are now, the focus is Gulf money. In a previous phase, it was Russian money. So Russian oligarchs helped pay for these stadiums. Russian taxpayers unwilling to help pay for the stadiums in Russia 2018. Roman Abramovich, the Russian oligarch, made Chelsea European champions with this kind of money. And now you have 3 Gulf monarchies that care about football. Qatar owns PSG, held the World Cup. United Arab Emirates owns Manchester City, most successful English club of the last decade. Saudi Arabia came to it late, kind of less imaginative royal family, less understanding of where soft power lies today. They copied Qatar. They were jealous of Qatar. They bought Newcastle United, one of the last remaining biggest clubs. And they, as you say, arranged with Infantino that they would get the World Cup 2034 with no counter bid. Australia wanted to bid, but FIFA kind of shortened the time frame for bidding in a way that made it impossible for Australia to do so. I think this phase is going to end because of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, which is going to hurt the Gulf states for a long time. So right now they can't export oil and gas much. But in future, the Europeans, India, Indonesia, Australia are going to say we can't rely on the Gulf for oil and gas because somebody might close the Strait of Hormuz again, even if it opens up. So I think that just like Russia had its phase of pouring money into soccer, the Gulf phase is happening. Saudi and will end. Saudi Arabia is already pulling out of a lot of things it's doing, starting with golf and women's tennis. I think women's tennis. And I think the soccer money is also going to flow much less lavishly than before. So the 2034 Saudi World Cup, I think they will keep it. I think they'll continue to do it because the prestige blow of losing that World Cup will be too much for them. After that, the Gulf phase of kind of dominating soccer finance will end. Also, Saudi Arabia paid ridiculously for this. They put $1 billion into the Club World Cup, which was held in the US last summer, which culminated with Donald Trump celebrating with the winners Chelsea and then pocketing a winner's medal, secretly putting into his suit pocket. So that, again, was a Saudi event. Infantino loves that. Infantino lived in Qatar prior to that World Cup. He's very close with the Saudi and Qatari royals, and he's close to whoever has money, but that direction of that money will shift.
Alexandra, it was you that mentioned the Olympics, and that's the obvious like equivalent that we draw on, especially as they're also based in Switzerland. And funnily enough, now headed by a woman. It seems to me very striking that the Olympics and the World Cup, the host cities and countries never put the question to their voters as to whether or not they're going to host it. And in fact, I recall I myself interviewed the Paris mayor before the Paris Olympics in 2024 and asked her why there had not been a referendum on hosting it when there's like referendums in Paris and all sorts of things. And she said, because they would have said no. That was sort of like a very honest answer, I thought. What's the risk for these hosts and countries, putting their hands up to host these things? And is the, prestige, as Simon put it, the prestige of being a host of the Olympics or the World Cup kind of beginning to lose its shine?
Yeah, I think it certainly is. And we have seen democracies in particular being more responsive to the public in their bids. I mean, Canada considered bidding and then didn't. Norway pulled out at one point. We're seeing a bit of a race to the bottom where we're going to have fewer and fewer democracies involved and more autocracies who see it as a way to launder their reputation, as Simon intimates. And also can generate the money without any transparency, which is key. It's striking how little transparency there is around these events, even in democracies. A lot of the contracts have confidentiality provisions, but yes, the appetite for events where highways are shut down so that executives from the IOC or FIFA or wherever else can travel in motorcades, all of that is distasteful for a lot of countries, and the more publicity it gets, the less appetite there is for it. So we are seeing Saudi Arabia get the World Cup, and we're seeing Winter Olympics in Russia. I mean, more recently in Italy, which did a fine job with it, but there just isn't going to be the appetite for these as they become more expensive without increased transparency or accountability. I think the public appetite for this is really thinning quickly. And how sad is it going to be when the major international sports events are held in countries with just appalling records on human rights, and they're anti-democratic, and typically also places where women's rights are secondary. I'm an enormous fan. I love soccer. I love the Olympics. I go to all of the Olympics, the Winter Olympics. I'm Canadian after all. But it's not being the governance is not only not keeping pace with the amount of money and the interest in this, it's falling behind. And that seems like a train wreck to me. I'm not sure how we pull sports back out of this.
Just a quick note for those online on the Zoom, please write down your questions or raise your hand on the little icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll have about another 15 minutes, so we'd love to hear any questions that you might have. But meanwhile, and maybe I can turn to you, Miguel. What should we be looking for in this World Cup? I mean, obviously the games are going to be really exciting. I think all of us are big, soccer fans that are going to be tuning in. But what are some of the kind of undercurrents that we should be aware of?
So my initial reaction following the Alexander will be, I will be looking forward to a Portuguese victory after all these discussions. But my passion for, in the end, I'll be looking at the matches. I'll try to forget the organization that is behind this and looking passionately at the matches, hoping for a Portuguese win. But I think that I very much agree with what Simon and Alexander said in terms of the future of these organizations. But I think there is an increasing tension that is emerging between the more they try to increase their revenues, the money that the pot of money that they generate, the more elitist they are becoming. And we're seeing this with the tickets of the World Cup now. We're seeing it with the fact that in several countries, I think it's the case of the UK, for example, the World Cup for the first time will not be broadcasted on open air TV. And there are several countries. In Portugal, there was a risk until recently that no open air television will broadcast the games. What would have been, first time. And this tells us of the extent to which there is an emerging tendency between the fact that these organizations are continuously working to maximize the way they monetize these events and the money they get out of them, and to continue to feed this machine of power that is supported by it. And on the other hand, the fact that this continues to be the people's sports. I always say football is the people's sports. FIFA is not the people's organization. And there is an increasing tension between the two. What will be the result of that? I don't know. My hope is that at a certain moment, public authorities will realize that there's something that they need to do, that they need to rein in, that they need to impose minimum standards, regulatory standards, governance standards on FIFA and its confederations. I mean, it's not easy for reasons that Simon described. FIFA has this very unique, I'm being ironic in here, approach to the principle of political neutrality, whereby they co-opt politicians, they nurture special relations with political actors, but at the same time, if any government or even a court of a state tries to regulate minimally their activity, they immediately consider that a violation of political neutrality on the part of that state and exclude their teams, their national teams, but also their club teams from their competitions. And no government wants to be responsible for that. And that makes it very difficult for individual governments. So I think only supranational, transnational organizations, that's why I've always put a lot of trust on the role that the European Union can have on this. the European Court of Justice has been the only judicial body that has effectively been able to regulate and impose some forms of regulation on FIFA. And the reason is simple. I always explain, at heart, I'm a EU lawyer, and I always explain it to my student as an example where the EU does not erode national sovereignty, but actually reinstates public sovereignty in an area where it has been lost. It's because they cannot, neither FIFA nor UEFA cannot go and say, well, we exclude Portugal, Spain, France, England, Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, Netherlands from our competition. They cannot do that. So it's the only organization that is empowered to bring back some level of regulation over FIFA. So and UEFA. So my hope is that at a certain moment the European Union will wake up, its political authorities and the national governments in the European Union will finally stop being co-opted or captured by sports organizations and will bring some minimum level of regulation, as the European Court of Justice has been demanding for a long time, actually.
Simon, do you see any signs out there that there's going to be a kind of growing backlash against FIFA's, like, insatiable, it seems, money making? Or are the fans just too invested in the sport and the clubs and the whole excitement around the World Cup? I mean, it seems like we regularly have this kind of debate around FIFA, and then the World Cup begins and people are just swept away by the excitement.
Yeah. They are, and they should be, because you also have to remember the World Cup doesn't belong to FIFA. The World Cup, as Miguel says, it's the people's sport. Everybody loves this. It's a real source of joy for humanity. It unites whole nations on the sofa. It's about the last shared experience that people have with each other, where not everyone is watching their own content on their own phone, but people are gathering in living rooms and bars, enjoying it together. We show in our book Soccernomics, Stefan Szymanski and I, reduces suicides in European countries that participate because the kind of communal feeling is so strong. People feel swept up in a greater whole. So people shouldn't boycott the World Cup because of FIFA. They should enjoy the World Cup and separate it from their feelings about FIFA. You still have great players and amazing underdog stories. It's all wonderful. What you are seeing now is that because in the run-up to the World Cup, there isn't much soccer to write about. There's just the stuff that we're talking about, Infantino and Trump. There is this mood of kind of negativity, and people are understandably very upset about all these things. And so the World Cup starts in this haze of negative publicity, which is entirely FIFA's doing and fault. And I wish it were different. I don't think FIFA is going to be reformed. As Miguel and Alexandra has said, there is no obvious route, there is no prospect. So I think we're going to live with this beautiful sport, beautiful World Cup, terrible FIFA stasis that we're in. And I don't think that saying, well, I'm not going to watch the World Cup is a good solution for people.
Alexandra, what are you watching for of the next month?
From a governance perspective?
Well, as a soccer fan, I'm assuming you're going to watch the World Cup, right?
Yeah, no, I'm going to some of the games. They're here in Vancouver. I share the kind of schizophrenic impulse of the rest of the world, where the sport is fantastic and exhilarating, and the sense of community that Simon describes is wonderful. And I will just grit my teeth and try to ignore the kind of cancerous barnacle of FIFA off to one side. But yeah, that's the only way to proceed, unless we imagine we are going to get some leverage with a boycott. And I just don't see that happening at all, because of the passion for the sport. So I'll be watching the games, attending some, watching others, and enjoying it alongside, the world's fans.
Any betting going on about who's going to win the World Cup, other than you, Miguel, who, you say Portugal, right? Simon, I mean, the thing about the World Cup, it does seem to produce a lot of surprises along the way.
I mean, this is This is the thing, you can't actually predict a World Cup because in a league, usually the richest club wins with the best players. 38 matches, luck tends to even out. World Cup is all about luck. You have 5 knockout rounds this time. Most will be decided by penalty shootouts or a single goal. So the ball that rolls off out of off the post rather than in off the post can make the difference. So that's one reason why people love the World Cup. There's a huge chance of underdogs winning an individual game. So, Curacao is not going to win the World Cup, but 150,000 people, they might win a game. And the other is it's like a mirror of life with all the kind of contingency and luck and unexpected events. So that makes it such a perfect drama. The World Cup isn't even particularly high quality. There's much better soccer on average in the Champions League or the Premier League now. But we don't watch the World Cup for the quality. We watch it for the drama and because the nation is at stake. Who's going to win? France and Spain are probably the best teams. That doesn't mean much.
I disagree with the last point of Simon, but no, I'm just
Right. Well, if there are one more call to the audience, as anyone wants to put their hands up to ask something, now's the moment. Otherwise, we will, I think, say goodbye to everybody and wait, one moment. Here we go. A question from Brian Bird. What about the aftermath, the financial costs to the host cities? Very good point. It seems like FIFA gets all the money, and yet none of it is shared with the hosts. New York, New Jersey paying for its security, transportation, and passing it on to fans. A $25 train fare from New York City to the stadium will be $100. Although I believe that they now made some kind of arrangement to bring that fare down. But that's a very good point. I mean, to a lot of these governors and mayors and so on, they didn't vote for this, and they certainly didn't ask the voters whether or not they wanted it.
Can I briefly answer that? Because we discussed this in Soccernomics. Yes, the model is FIFA takes all the money and the host cities and country have all the costs. Luckily, in the US, Mexico, and Canada, there were no new stadiums to build. But yeah, all the costs of policing security are for the host cities. It was their fault in the US that they bid. So Chicago and Minneapolis were smart enough to realize the financial is terrible and they didn't bid. So these other cities have been landed with it. Then there was this belief, well, you get tourists. In fact, it suppresses tourism in cities like New York or Vancouver or Miami, where normally in summer, a lot of people come as a tourist. Those regular flows of tourists think, well, I'm not going to go now because there's a World Cup on. It will be more expensive. There'll be security hassle. So I'll go somewhere else. I'm not going to go to Vancouver this summer. I'll find another holiday destination. So very often you see actually that the tourism falls rather than rises as a result of a World Cup.
There's strong economic evidence that usually big sports events of this time do not bring benefits to the hosting countries. I mean, the cost-benefit analysis ends up being that the costs outweigh the benefits for hosting countries. It's not always the case. It depends on circumstances, but overwhelming, the evidence goes in that direction. And that's the reason why increasingly you will see, and we are seeing, that is autocratic regimes that get this to host these events because their benefits are of a different nature. It's the political capital that they gain by hosting these events. And I think, unfortunately, we'll see more and more of that.
Yeah, I would agree with Simon's point about the stadium. The one thing that is encouraging about this World Cup spread across 3 countries is that there wasn't a lot of new building, which from an environmental and financial perspective is really important. But there's no question that Vancouver and Toronto are bracing for the financial hangover after the fun is over.
There's one last question, although I believe we've sort of covered this, which is, could players have a role in pushing for reforms? Do they have enough influence to demand changes within FIFA? And I think it was either Simon or Miguel, one of you said that there's no incentive for them to do that. And I believe I remember this in Qatar, where, no one really among the players' organizations spoke up about human rights abuses or workers who died. Is that correct?
So, Simon, but please go ahead,
No,
Simon.
go ahead, Mingo. Go ahead.
No, players they either go through the ranks of the football organizations, and they often start by being co-opted as ambassadors to get a certain visibility, and they are used by the FIFA itself. And some of them then manage to acquire a position in the National Football Association. But that means that when they arrive at the high levels of power, they play by the same rules that the others have always played. They are one more element of machine. If the president of FIFA, I'm sorry to say, would have been Platini instead of Infantino, the evolution of FIFA would have been exactly the same, from my point of view. It wouldn't change a bit, no difference. And in fact, as president of UEFA, Platini was no different than any other president will be. And that's one thing that players will do. The players would only be factored to promote change if their participation will be part of a much deeper reform in the mechanism, in the electoral mechanisms of FIFA. So if FIFA, for example, if it's the election for FIFA president or FIFA council will no longer take place under the current rules, but the electoral universe will be dramatically changed to open up to participation in the elections by supporters organizations, athletes organizations, more minimum female representation in the electoral, in those that vote themselves. That could change FIFA if you would have, but that will not happen. Certainly not promoted by FIFA itself.
Well, all of you, thank you so much for your participation. Thanks for everybody who clicked on. Please remember this will be on YouTube, living on in eternity, like FIFA apparently. And so, you know, anytime you want to rewatch it or tell your friends to rewatch it, and have a good time at the World Cup.